looking like this? Tell me, am I looking like this? No, not at all.
Hey, what's going on, you beautiful people? My name's Ty-Dye. I hope you guys had a pretty awesome day today. My day's been pretty awesome so far, so welcome to a brand new tutorial here. Today, I'm going to be bringing you guys an in-depth tutorial on how to do some awesome UV techniques within Maya. We're going to be UVing a bit more of a complex object today, and more specifically, we are going to be UVing this lamp here. Now, this is a bit more of an advanced object, I'd say. I'd say if you can confidently UV this object here, you should be pretty comfortable UVing most objects. So I'm going to go through every single thing that I did to UV this asset here. This is just part of a larger scene here that I'm still working on. There's still quite a bit of work to do, but we're just going to be focusing on this lamp today. As you can see, there are some parts that are a bit tricky. For example, this long cable here, and these springs, especially some of the bolts. And even this head up here might be a little bit different to tackle if you are a bit new to UVing, or maybe you're just not as confident as you could be with UVing. So I'm just going to exit out of this so it doesn't slow everything down here, and we are going to dive into Maya. So this is the lamp that we're going to be working with. If you guys do want to follow along, I'll have a download link to this lamp in the description below, actually. So if you guys are still getting used to UVing, you can follow along. And I'd say, like I said before, if you can confidently UV this asset, you should be okay with most assets out there. We do go over some pretty advanced stuff with, say, these springs, for example. And just some basic techniques that you're going to be using for most objects out there. And since this is such a weird shape, I think if you can do this, you should be pretty good overall. So let's open up our UVs right now to see what that looks like. And one thing I would recommend when doing any sort of UV work is to have multiple monitors. For this tutorial, I'm going to have to use just this one monitor so that I can record and do it at the same time and show you guys what I'm doing. But if you are doing this on your own, it is super helpful to get a second monitor, especially if you're on a computer. You can easily get another one for under like 200 bucks. And it really does speed up your workflow quite a bit. So this is the final results of what we're going for here. I think I packed this in pretty well. Obviously there's some room here and some room there and there, but as far as where these objects are laid out, I'm pretty happy with this, and I think I did a pretty good job with that. But what we are going to do is go to UV, and then we have to delete current UV set. Let's see. Sorry, UV, delete UVs. There we go. Sorry, I don't delete UVs too often. I think for most people, you'd rather be making them than deleting them. So essentially now we don't have our UVs there, so we are going to have to start from scratch. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is make a checker material. Now, for those of you who don't know, a checker material essentially allows us to see if we're UVing our object correctly, because it's essentially just a very formulated pattern in which when we wrap it around our object, we can easily see if there is disturbance in the way that it's being wrapped and if there is some stretching anywhere. So it's just an easy way to check if we are doing our work. But one thing I do want to ask before we dive too far into this, guys, is if you guys could please drop a like on this video, that would be great. The only reason I'm like really asking for it this time is because UVing really isn't the most fun thing in the world, and that's not me saying I don't want to make this video. It's just that, I don't know, UVing is definitely one of those things that people are like, oh god, I really don't want to do that. So hopefully you guys can learn something out of this and speed up your process, and I'd really appreciate it if you could support me on this video in any way kind of possible. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's start with making our checker texture. So we're just going to select our object, hold the right mouse button down, and go to assign favorite material. Let's just do a Lambert for this specific example, and wait for that to pop up on the side here. And let's find it, Lambert 2. I'm just going to call this checker, and hit enter there. And then under color, I'm going to select this little checker box. And from here, what we can do is actually input a file. So by selecting file here, we can sort of press this little folder, and we can select whatever sort of checker texture we want. Now, I already have one downloaded. If you guys want to, you can just search on Google Images UV checker texture, or just checker texture, and something will definitely come up for sure. So let me just find where I have mine. I have a folder called Maya Projects, and I remember I saved an old checker texture in here before. This is just the one that I like because it sort of shows the colors and very, very easily identifiable numbers on there to let you know if they're facing the right direction and whatnot. So if I hit open on there, now we have a checker texture. The next thing I'm going to do is under place 2D textures 1. I'm just going to sort of change the repeat UV from 1 to maybe 2. And if I turn on textures, we're going to see that obviously, since we have no UVs, it's just a solid color. It has nothing to work with right now. So as we start UVing it, we will start seeing the checker pop up. But if we did have any sort of UVs on here, we would see something. For example, if I just go to UV planar, we'll see that now we sort of have these checkers wrapping around the object from, you know, up and down, from the y-axis. So if you look from above, it looks really good, but then when you look from angles, there's some serious distortion everywhere else. So obviously we don't want that. I'm just going to Control Z out of that, and we can start to break apart this object and start UVing it in a way that sort of makes sense for this model. Now, what I'm thinking for this object is I'm going to sort of work my way up, starting at the bottom, and then I think the final thing I'll do is probably this long connecting cable here that's going from the top all the way to the bottom, and we can do that in one piece. It's really not as difficult as people may think. There are certain ways, especially around like coils and stuff like that, that does make it a lot more simple. But let's start with the base of this, which is probably going to be the easiest part. So if I just double click on it, since it is one object, one group, it's just going to select that group there. And I'm just going to deselect up into a point where I can confidently unwrap this object. So I'm thinking probably this side part is going to have to be unwrapped horizontally in some kind of way, and then this could be unwrapped from above and then sideways and then sideways, and then this has to be from above as well. So I'm going to break this apart into even smaller pieces. So by clicking, holding shift and double clicking the polygon beside it, I can select an entire ring, and I'm going to be doing that all the way up the side here. Up until about there, I'd say, because this part we can make its own little shell. And from here, what I can do is go to UV, planar, and hit the little square there. And we can project it from, I'm just looking at this little axis here, we can project it from the Z-axis, hit apply, and get a pretty good result there. So now if we go over to our UV editor, I'm just going to turn off this texture in the background by hitting this little mountain here. We can see sort of a representation of the side of our UV faces that we just made here in the UV editor. And if we start to rotate, we see some seriously messy UV work here on the sides, and that's because we still have to unfold our object. So I need to find a spot where a seam would be pretty appropriate. Where can I cut this to unfold it from, where not a lot of people are going to see? And I think for this specific example, I think underneath this cable would probably be the best spot to do it. So I'm just going to select the edges underneath that cable, going down our selected area that we previously did. And with all of those edges selected, going down the part we just UV'd, I can go to polygons, cut UV edges, and now essentially there's a slice down here that we can unfold from. So if I hold right click in the UV editor and go to UVs and select all our UVs and right click on this little sideways T or an unfolded box or even a Tetris piece, I'm not exactly sure what that's supposed to be. If we right click on that, what we can do now is unfold that. So if your UV options don't look the same as mine, there might be a little checkbox at the top with two options. Just select the bottom option and it'll take you to this page. But either way, just right click this icon here, like I said, to get here. And now that we know we have cut it, we can unfold it horizontally, which we want to do because it's going to sort of open it up as wide as possible. So by selecting horizontal in our options and hitting apply, we have now unfolded our object. And we can now see that here as well. It is looking good all the way around our object, just with that one seam there in the texture. But that's okay because that's probably the most hidden it'll be, especially from certain angles you just cannot see it at all. And I'm pretty happy with that. And now let's try to unfold it vertically to see if that makes any difference. And it just sort of stretches it a little bit, just to sort of make the tops and the bottoms a bit more even. And that's already our first part done. So I am just going to sort of keep these shells the default size. We'll go back and resize everything later, and I'll explain more about that. Essentially, we want all of these squares to be the same size across everything on this model. So I'm just going to keep that the same for now, and dive into the next part. So the next part is very similar, and you'll start to see with a lot of the stuff, it is very, very, very repetitive. There's a very clear reason why a lot of people don't find UVing to be the most fun thing in the world. So I think I'm going to select up to here because this is where it starts to curve up quite a bit, and I'll have this as its own piece. So for this one, I'm going to do a planar from the y-axis because it's going up and down, right? The best way to sort of project this would be from looking directly above it. So if I do that, I get this shell here, which is pretty much already perfectly done. But if I select all the UVs, right click on that icon again and just do a horizontal and a vertical unfold just to check that it's unfolded as best as possible, we sort of have our next piece already done. And actually, I think it might be easier just to resize this as we go. So I'm gonna, wow, I'm just gonna scale this. Sorry, wow, I'm slurring my words. It's pretty early in the morning right now. I'm gonna resize this, just to sort of match the size of our bottom shell there. So that's 2 parts already done. We're gonna continue that. It's gonna get a bit more complicated once we get to the base part here, but for now it's just easy street. We're just sort of getting our bearings, right? So once again, just click, holding shift and double clicking the one beside it. And we can select this ring. This is going to be very similar to this part here. We are going to have to make a seam. So before we unfolded it along the z-axis, I want to do that again. And let's keep the seams pretty uniform. So we'll make a texture seam where it was before. So I'm just going to select all the edges on that piece to line up with the edges with these ones, just so it's, you know, very similar as to where the seams are. And then once again, with those edges selected, polygon, cut UV edges, select all of our UVs, and then we can sort of go into our unfold options here and do a horizontal and then a vertical unfold. And that's looking pretty good. Yes, there's a little bit of distortion here, like a tiny bit, but for an object like this, and especially considering how small that is, this is perfectly fine. And then I'm just going to sort of scale this to the appropriate size, like so, and move on to the next piece. The next piece, though, is going to be this ring. We're going to want it to be separated because it is on a completely different angle than this face ring here and this face ring here. So I'm going to sort of select these faces and just do a UV planar from Y because it's best projected from above. And it's already perfect because it is just, you know, one sort of set. And I'm going to scale that to how it should be and move that somewhere where it's out of the way. And we're already done the entire base of that. So that wasn't too hard at all. That was very quick. Let's continue along here with this set. And this is also going to be very, very similar to what we just did. Once again, UV, planar in Z. And as you can see, very, very repetitive work. We're going to select that same edge that we did for all the other ones. And just polygon, cut UV edges. Select all of those, right click, horizontal, and even a vertical, just to see if we can round that out a bit. And yep, that's looking good. Rescale that to be uniform with everything else. And just sort of put that somewhere where it is easy to sort of look at and matches with everything. Okay, and this I think is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. So what we're going to do here is sort of break this up into little bits. So first thing that I can say here is once we start to get these like screws and these springs, there are certain parts that are repeating here, right? Like all of these screws are the same and these springs are all the same. So what we can do is just UV1 and replace the other pieces. We could transfer attributes as well, but for this specific case, I'm probably just going to manually move them into place. And let's get to it then. So before we do any of that, I am just going to double click this part because this is its own little selection here. So if I double click any of these, it's just going to select very certain pieces as they were all made from different objects and merged together. So if I select this by double clicking it, I can actually isolate it by hitting this little icon here, and now we have something easier to work with. And I can zoom in on this, and this is something that's pretty easy to work with. It's not the hardest thing to UV unwrap. It's essentially just the same techniques we did as before. So once again, selecting these faces, I can UV planar in Z. And let's just try and get that same angle. I'm going to select this edge, polygon, cut UV edges, and select everything here. Right click and do a little horizontal unfold, and that's already perfectly done. And as you can see, essentially the main thing you want to do here is just break things up into little pieces, right? It's very daunting to look at a big object like this lamp and not want to do it all at once, but if you are breaking it up into little pieces, it really isn't that difficult at all. The next thing I'm going to do is sort of select all these faces by, once again, clicking, holding shift and double clicking, and it'll select this entire ring around. Very same principle. Once again, we're going to planar in Z. And just cut it where we cut all the other ones. and unfold it. This one is going to be rather long though, but I don't think it's going to be too big, so really nothing to worry about. So we're going to unfold that, and we'll just move it here for now. Next we can do these faces here. So I'm just going to select all of these faces and all of the faces on the bottom. We can do a UV planar from the y-axis. And as you can see, we got that UV'd as well. These ones though, if we look at it, the numbers are all backwards. So a great way to check if our textures are going to appear backwards is if we hit this little icon here, which shows sort of like a blue turning into red gradient. Or, sorry, no, the one before, just the blue square. And anything that is red in the UV editor is actually flipped backwards. So the way that we can do that is by selecting that shell and going to polygons and then flip. And just make sure it's on flip horizontal. And when we hit apply, the numbers will be back to normal and it'll be flipped horizontally. I can then move these shells into position somewhere here where they're out of the way and continue along the way we were before by selecting these faces. Once again, UV planar in the z-axis, and we're just going to, I'm going to turn this off by the way, the thing that tells you which direction they're facing, just because the numbers do a pretty good job of that. I'm going to select that edge there and go to polygon, cut UV edges, select all of these UVs, and just unfold it horizontally once again. Select that shell, bring it into a size that's a bit more uniform with everything else. Even this one I should probably bring it up a bit so it's a bit more uniform as well. Just trying to make everything very similar in size. And then finally, the only thing we have left to do on this piece is just this top part here. So just select all the faces on the top here. And we're just going to do a planar from the y-axis. Oh, I guess I I selected these faces as well. Sorry, we'll just do that again. And then scale that to size. Put that somewhere. And that's essentially that entire part done. So I can unselect this so we show everything. And then I can just select all these shells at once and scale them to be a bit more uniform with the rest of the shape. And just put that up there out of the way for now. So working our way up, we're making some pretty good progress here. We're going to start to dive into a couple more of the advanced shapes now. But hopefully you guys are feeling a bit more confident with this stuff and realizing that when you do break it up into little pieces, it really isn't that difficult at all. So the next part we're going to sort of dive into is this bracket here, which is actually a lot easier than it appears to be. So I'm just going to isolate that once again. And excuse me guys, I'm just going to take a quick sip of tea here. Almost 20 minutes of straight talking gets your throat a little bit dry. So yeah, we're just going to dive into this next part, which is pretty easy overall. One of the main things that we're going to want to do here is separate this into two main components. Or three main components rather. The inside faces, the outside faces, and the faces wrapping along the top and bottom. So let's try and get the faces wrapping around the top and bottom first. That shouldn't be too difficult to do. So I'm going to separate that into a couple shells here. So I'm going to select these faces here because there's a hard cutoff angle. So if there is a seam here, it really doesn't matter all that much. Let's see, what's the best way to go about doing this? I'll select these faces here, yeah, and do a planar from Y. And just shrink that a bit because it's a bit too large. And then I'll do these bottom faces here. And the reason I'm doing this is just to sort of break it up into shapes that make the most sense for where I should be cutting these seams. I essentially just want there to be this one big rounded edge piece that goes all the way around here. And I think this is a natural spot to sort of cut that off. So once again, I can sort of UV planar that from Y. And these are all backwards, of course. Yep. So I can just sort of flip those UVs and sort of put those into position somewhere where they're out of the way. And now we can sort of get to the part where we select all these faces around. Just using our click, shift, double click method. So once again, clicking, holding shift, and double clicking somewhere. Oh, it's gone the wrong way. I guess this one we can just do it in little pieces. Essentially, I'm just trying to select all the faces going around because I know that these ones can be unwrapped together into a single shell. Well, two parts, but one sort of unwrap. So if I go to UV planar and Y and hit apply, we're gonna get these two little rectangles here, and they're representing how we see it from above, right? So essentially, since they're already cut, we can just sort of go and select those UVs and unfold those horizontally. And we'll try vertical to see if that makes a difference. And now we sort of have this perfectly unwrapped all the way around as well. So that's on its own already a big part of that done. And you just really have to think before you execute, right? It's one of those things where it's just as much thinking as it is doing, right? So good planning leads to easier work. So the next part is super, super easy. The only tedious part essentially is selecting all of the faces. So we're gonna have to select all the outside faces. So let's start by just, clicking and holding shift and selecting these faces here. And the reason I'm selecting all the ones on the outside first is because we can unfold those together, as they are all connected in one way or another. And then we can unfold all the inside faces at the same time as well. So just going around and selecting everything. It is a bit tedious. I'm sure there might be a better way to do that. But as of now, this is the method I'm going with. So just going around selecting everything. And now we have our entire outside selected. I just want to make sure, yep, that there's nothing on the inside that's selected. And we seem to be good now that I unselected those points. And now if we UV planar from the x-axis, we'll get it from directly in front. And what we can do here is select all of those faces and unfold it horizontally. And now we get this perfect unfold of the outside that wraps around the entire outside faces there. So that's pretty cool. We're going to do the exact same method for the inside. I'm just going to rotate this upside down so it fits into this little selection a bit more. And I think I can probably do this a bit easier. If I select all the faces and then deselect the faces we already UV'd, it should just leave the ones that we haven't UV'd here. And then from there I can just sort of planar them from the x-axis once again. Select all of those and do a horizontal unfold. And then we have the inside done as well. So yeah, it's just, planning leads to a faster and more efficient way of doing all this stuff. So now all of those shells are done. We can deselect that as our isolation and scale that appropriately to match the rest of our objects and just sort of move that up there to work with later. Yeah, so that's essentially one of the most complex objects that we have here, other than maybe the springs or something like that, which we're going to get to very, very shortly. So now let's move on to the bolts. The bolts are super, super simple. I'm sure you guys could figure out how to do them on your own, but let's get to them anyways. Because, I mean, in a sense, these don't necessarily have to be UV'd. They could be completely normal mapped, but I decided to keep them in just because in case someone was really digging in there. And for the scene that I'm doing, I want to sort of put as much detail into my models as possible. So as you guys will very quickly see, UVing this is simple. It's just sort of, the concept of UVing something and then moving it to multiple places in the model that is interesting. That's why I sort of kept it in here. So essentially this is really, really simple. I am just going to sort of select everything but the ring around the edges and planar that all at once. So UV planar in the z-axis. And as you can see, we got this selection here with the texture being super, super small. So I'm going to scale that down in our UV editor just for now. And we are going to unfold that a bit just so we get perfect UVs here. Horizontal unfold and a vertical. Just because these edge parts are a bit of a bevel that need to be addressed in the UV editor. And then now we can do the edge part just by clicking, holding shift, and double clicking the next part just to sort of select that entire ring. And this would probably be a good projection from the y-axis. And then from there, I'd say probably the best spot to cut it from would probably be the bottom, in which we can go to polygon, cut UV edges, grab those UVs, and then unfold that horizontally. And I'm just going to sort of scale this to be uniform with the rest of the object. So there we go, that's the UVs for that. It is rather large in the editor, but considering that we're going to have some gaps, I don't mind making it a bit bigger than it needs to be, especially because I am going to put some normal map detail on there for sort of like some slants and slits and stuff in it, sort of implement that a screwdriver could go in there. So with that one done, there's a couple ways that we could go about do this. We could transfer attributes, but that would require us to essentially have to make all of these different objects and then bring them back together again, which is kind of annoying. So instead what I'm going to do is just sort of select these faces and delete them, and then select these faces, and actually what I can do is go to Edit Mesh, or Edit Mesh and Extract, and make this a separate object. So from here, when we extract it, our pivot point is usually in a very obscure location. So to get it back, we can go to Modify Center Pivot. And then what I can do here is just sort of put the bolts back to where they should be by pressing Control Duplicate on a new object and just sort of moving it into position, making sure it is secure on there, and then maybe even rotating it slightly just to sort of make it look like it is a bit of a different angle and whatnot. And then we can do the same for these screws on the back here. So just deleting that and deleting that. And once again, Control Duplicate and move that around. One of the things we're going to have to do though is rotate it. So I'm going to go to our channel box and a layer editor. And I'm actually going to unrotate this. So I'm going to bring the Z rotation back to 0, just so that we have our axis here to be a little bit straighter. And then I can actually just sort of grab this axis here and rotate it, I guess that's Y, by 180 degrees and plop that back into place. So that's that, and then I can duplicate this one and move it back to where it should be on the corresponding edge. Since you'll never see both of them at the same time, they don't have to be exactly lined up, but if you do want to do that, you can go into the wireframe editor and maybe even a side viewport just to get it exactly lined up. But it's definitely one of those cases where you can sort of get away with not having it like that. And then I'm just going to sort of rotate it now that we are essentially in a place where it's safe to do so. So that's that. We are going to use these bolts again for up here and up here as well. But we'll get to that later on. As of now, we are going to move on to this sort of this little piece that's sort of holding the spring into place. So this is also another one of those things where we can just sort of isolate it, and it's also a very easy object to do. So to UV this, I'm going to do a bunch of pieces at once. So I'm going to select this ring, this ring, and this ring here. And I know they're all going to be UV'd in Y, so I might as well just do them all at the same time here. And just go to UV, Planar, and Y. And from here I can just sort of rotate to the bottom and just sort of select all the edges on the bottom, because that's where it's going to be hidden the most. And go to Polygon, cut UV edges, grab all of those UVs, and give it a horizontal unfold. From here we can sort of separate the shells that we just made so they're a bit easier to identify. And unselect that and just sort of bring that down to a more appropriate UV size that's a bit more uniform with everything. And I'll move that out of the way for now. One of the things I forgot to do though with the bolts is they're actually all separate objects right now. So if I select them all again, I can select our main piece and go to Mesh, Combine. And then we're going to center our pivot again, so modify Center Pivot. And now we have a bunch of different shells on top of each other, so I'm actually just going to make sure that they're not overlapping. So I'm going to double click on each bolt and sort of drag down the pieces just so that none of the UVs are overlapping. Essentially we could give them the same texture, but for this I was sort of going for a more detailed object, so giving them their own UV space would be ideal. And now we have this object that we just made here. I'm just going to sort of keep all of these sort of bolts together in one way or another. So that's going to be there. And what we can do now is delete this bolt, double click on this one, go to Edit Mesh, Extract, modify Center Pivot again, Control duplicate that and just sort of move it into position here. And then once again, merge all these shapes and do the same. So mesh, combine, modify, center pivot, and then grab the UVs from this and just drag it down in the editor. All right, so that is that part done. Essentially, if you've made it this far, you should at least have an idea as to how to tackle the rest of this object. This essentially covers most of it, but I'm going to still, of course, continue with the rest of this. I'd highly recommend just continuing practicing and doing this whole thing if you are still getting confident with how to UV. This next part is very, very different to the rest of the method, though. We are actually going to look at how to UV the springs. Oh, actually, shoot, I actually forgot about these end pieces here. Let me just select these. And I'm sure there's people who are watching this that actually caught that. My bad. But as expected, these are very, very simple angles to UV. So I'm just going to UV that from Z. And just scale that appropriately to something that makes sense. Okay. I'm going to move that over here and just make sure these shells aren't on top of each other. Okay, so essentially with that being done, that means I need to delete this one and just go through that process again with edit mesh, extract, modify, center pivot. I guess it's good to just sort of continuously practice this and repeat it anyways. So just going to drag these shells down. And now we can sort of just merge everything once again. Mesh, combine, modify, and center pivot. Alright, so now we can finally move on to the spring. The spring is definitely, probably I would say for most people would be the hardest part just because of it's such an interesting object, but for a lot of people they don't realize there are specific ways to sort of go about doing this. For me, what I'm going to do is just isolate this spring here just so we can focus on this. And the first thing I want to do is just sort of UV the end pieces. The end pieces are what are going to essentially screw us up a little bit if we don't get those right away. So I am just going to select these end pieces. And in hindsight, they're such tiny details. If they were UV'd incorrectly, it really wouldn't matter. That being said, I still do want to UV them correctly, just because I want this to be as professionally done as possible. So I'm going to select all of those. And I think they would both work from a Y, I'd like to say. So I'm just going to put them together in the editor so it's easier to see and blow them up. And yeah, it's really not too bad the way it is, but of course we want to do our signature unfold in the horizontal and vertical. And obviously that is way too big for what they actually are, but we will address that later. So now I'm going to select all of the faces except for the end pieces. It's very important that we don't select these end pieces here. And we're going to do something a little bit different here. We are going to go to polygon and then unitize. And what that does is essentially takes all of these polygons here, all of them, and turn them into perfect squares in our UV editor on top of each other. So if I select one of these faces and move it, there's just a whole bunch of squares on top of each other now, which are all these polygons here. So this is good because now what we can do is, since they're all together on top of each other, we can select all of our edges, and let's just find sort of a place where, well, let me just sort of move these end pieces out of the way. We can select all of our edges except for our end pieces, and let's just find where a seam would work for this object. I think I'm probably gonna say along the inside somewhere. And then what we do is we unselect that edge where we want the seam to be. And as you can see, that's not a good spot because it's right in the middle. I I'm just trying to find a good spot for a seam on this object. Maybe flipping it to the other side, and let's try the inside part here. That seems to be a pretty good spot for a seam. So once again, we selected all the edges and then deselected by double clicking while holding Control. And we deselected an entire ring of edges there. And what we can do with all of our edges but one line of edges selected, we can go to Polygons, Cut UV Edges, and then Polygon, Move and Sew UV Edges. And that essentially takes this object and stretches it into this huge line of all of those squares that we had before, but with that one seam we created. So I can essentially zoom in on this, and it's near perfect UVs. It ain't perfect, but it's close. So if I zoom in, as you can see, we have a ton of tiny squares here representing our texture. But what we can do now is take this and unfold it and get a perfect UV of this object. So once again, horizontal unfold and a vertical unfold. And we have this ginormous UV shell here. And essentially we can scale this down quite a bit because we really don't need it to be that massive, and this is just totally out of the question to work with. So we're just going to scale. And even now, say if I unselect this object, there's still quite a bit of texture room to work with. So I essentially sort of want to maybe get it to like this size here, but we still can cut it along somewhere if we want to. For example, like if I cut it along the middle, no one's really going to notice. If I just sort of do a cut here and just put these shells on top of each other with these end pieces there as well, which, like I said before, are too big, but I can scale those down. And now we have this perfectly UV'd. And I just want to make sure that's to scale. It's a bit hard to tell when it's like wrapped up like that, but I think that appears to be correct. I know that it's correct as in it'll have a texture wrap around it. I'm just trying to make sure that this checker is the same size as these checkers. And I think it is for now. So I am calling that done as far as that goes. And now we can sort of move on to the next one. So what we can do is, just like before, we can delete what we don't need and what we're going to mirror, and select this spring here. And we can essentially go to, let's see, Edit Mesh, Extract to make it its own object. Go to Modify Center Pivot, and we can Control D to duplicate it. And all we really have to do now is scale it -1 in the z-axis, just so that it sort of, just so that it flips over on itself, right? So now we have this total perfect copy, but it's mirrored over in a sense. So I can just sort of put that into position, and now we have our spring perfectly placed on the other side. All we have to do for this is essentially move the UV shells up a little bit, and put all of these objects back together. Mesh, Combine, and Modify Center Pivot. And now we have two springs here. And I'm just going to check if anything needs to be flipped over. It doesn't appear that way. And yep, we can move to the next part now. So that's good. The next part is this big sort of like arm shaft thing here. So we can dive into that. That's also a very easy part that we can tackle. So let's dive right into that. Actually, before we do that, we just have these bolts here, but they're the same as the bolts as before. So I'm just going to select these, delete them, and then we can select these here. Edit Mesh, Extract, Modify Center Pivot. And from here what we can do is just Control D to duplicate and just move these up into the desired positioning. which is there. And now we have the next part UV'd. So now we can just select everything once again as we were doing before and merge them. Modify center pivot. And then once again, just sort of move these shells. So just selecting these faces, moving that down, and selecting these faces and moving that down in our editor. And we are well on our way to being done this. So now we can sort of move on to these next pieces, which are super easy to UV. We're just gonna double select it with our face selection on and isolate that. And we are going to select just these faces here without the top or the bottom. And let's do a UV projection from the x-axis, so we're facing it from this way, head on. And then I would say a good spot to put a seam would probably just be somewhere on the inside here of the back. So selecting a face there, going to polygon, cut UV edges, and just continuing our unfold method. I'm also going to do a vertical on this one. And that's essentially that part done right there. Super easy. We are going to have to do the faces on the top though, so just select those faces on the top. And the bottom, of course, and do a UV planar in the y-axis. And then we're just going to unfold those as well, just to make sure that they are as accurate as possible with a horizontal and a vertical unfold. And then scaling them appropriately to match the rest of the object. Okay. Now we can just do that for the next one as well, and I'm actually going to do all 4 of these at once. Now for those of you who are modeling an object, this is sort of a good time to think like, hey, if I were to be modeling this, would it make sense to just sort of model one piece, UV it, and reuse it? Obviously, if you're making this stuff from scratch, I'd highly recommend UVing one of those bolts before you sort of duplicate it so you save the time when you are UVing it. Or for example, when you're doing stuff like this part is the same as... well, some of these parts are the same, like these 2 are the same, and these 2 I believe are also the same in height. So you might as well just UV one and then duplicate it after. So UVing as you go is definitely very smart, but this is just a way to explain how I do all of this from scratch anyways. But yeah, we're just going to do the same technique here once again, UV planar from the x-axis. We're going to cut that along where we cut it before, that inside edge. And of course do our unfold. In both horizontal and vertical. And then of course just get the faces on the top and the bottom. Oh, I guess I selected more faces than I should have there. Alright, let's try that again. UV. Okay, I keep selecting more faces than I should. Let's try this again. UV. There we go. So I just kept selecting these springs by accident, but managed to get over that really fast. And just moving these into position, and then scaling things to the way that they should be. Shrinking that down, moving that below, and let's just put these together for now. So that's 2 of them done. Let's get to the next 2. This is becoming a bit more of a longer tutorial than I thought it was going to be. Man, UVing, what a blast. I totally understand why people aren't the most fond of UVing, but it really isn't that bad. For me at least, I find that if I just put on some good music and get to it, it really isn't the most boring thing in the world. It can be pretty relaxing, especially after trying to make something look really good, and just sort of unwrapping it can be, you know, in a way just a really good way to unwind and just sort of enjoy your model and look at all the little details of it. So once again, I'm going to planar this time from the y-axis and then cut it along the same seam as we were doing before, just sort of like the inside and off to the side there. This time though, since it's facing horizontal, I'm going to do a vertical unfold first, and then a horizontal. And then just rotate that twice to sort of match the other ones. And then we can just sort of select the faces on the end here. And I think this would be better to do from the x-axis. And when in doubt as to which ones you should be doing, just sort of look at the little axis on the bottom there. And essentially whichever way it's facing and you think would be the best way to represent a good starting point, go from there. So for example, I'm looking at this head on, and as you can see, I'm looking at it from the x-axis. So do an x-axis unfold. Typically you should be able to tell, but this is just one of those things where practice and experience definitely aids you quite a bit. This one seems to be almost the right size, but we've got to scale that down a bit and fit that into place. And now we just got one more to go. So we are going to do the same thing, plane on that from the y-axis. Cut it from the same seam we were doing before. Bring that over a little bit so we have more room to work with. Grab all those UVs and do a vertical, then a horizontal unfold. Just going to rotate that, put it into place. And then just select these edge parts, or these end parts rather. And from the x-axis as we did before. There we go. And horizontal, vertical. And let's just scale those down to match and fit that up with everyone else. So now we have all those parts done. And as you can see, they're a bit larger than everything else. So what we can do is scale that up in the UV editor so the squares match the rest of them. And let's just put that off to the side. Our next step is this little bracket part here. Of course, all of these screws we've already done, so we can just move those into position after, as well as the spring. And this is actually a new part here, this little twisty knob. So that's not too bad. And then up here we just have sort of similar pieces. So we are essentially getting to a point where we have done everything. There's just a few new pieces that we have to do. So just this little holder, the wire, and the lamp head. So this really is coming together rather quickly. As you can see though, we are about 47 minutes into the recording. So yeah, it is a rather lengthy thing to do, but it really isn't that bad. I think people make UVing out to be a lot worse than it is. This seems to be like a difficult object, but it really isn't. I'm going to select everything but the edges that wrap around the top and the bottom there. And what we can do is planar these all together. And let's see, what's the best axis for this? The Z-axis. So we should have a bunch of pieces here. And we can just sort of move these. There are some that are going to be reversed, yep. So just by clicking that square once again and then selecting the red faces, I can go to polygon and flip. And just sort of move these into sort of a pattern that takes up the least amount of space. Let's see. How should I go about doing this? Maybe, yeah, let's go with this. Just sort of put them together like so. And I think this takes up the least amount of space, at least for now, at least for the time being. That's a pretty good way to handle that. And that essentially leaves us with just this end part, which we can also do with one projection and one unfold. So just selecting that ring there, going to UV, planar, and Y. We get these rings here. And then let's find a spot where no one's going to see for the seam, probably down here at the bottom. Polygon, cut UV edges, and essentially we're just going to unfold that. And this part's already done. Super fast. Some parts seem a little bit more difficult than they actually are. But don't worry guys, like for the most part, UVing is a rather straightforward thing. It only gets really difficult when you start getting into like very, very complex and like really organic looking shapes, I would say. So now we can start deleting some of these things that we don't need. For example, these two screws here. You just got to remember where they are more or less, but it's like one there, easy to remember. And I'm just going to bring up some screws. So once again, we are going to extract that. And then as it's being a separate object, we're going to have to center the pivot. And then Control D to duplicate it. I'm just going to move it up here. One was in this position. And we'll Control D to duplicate it again. And one was in this position. Let's just get that a little bit more accurate. Yep. And then we can delete these ones here. And for this one, there's actually 3 of them. So just remember, 1 for each of the bars. So let me just duplicate this and flip it over. Let's rotate that 180 degrees, and I believe that is the y-axis. Yep. So we'll plop that into position. Control duplicate, move this one over here, and Control duplicate again, and move one up here. At this point, I'm going to rotate them all a bit, just to sort of differentiate them from each other. Because we don't want it to be too boring or anything. All the little details really do take it a long way. So actually, before I merge them, I might as well just do these parts as well, and I just merge them all together at once. So I'm going to delete that and that. And we've already done this part, so it shouldn't be too difficult to do. Select this and go to Edit Mesh, Extract. And then modify center pivot, and then Control D to duplicate it, and just sort of move that into position right about there. For those of you wondering, yes, there are faces on the inside. We can delete those later. If you really are concerned about that, it would definitely be the correct thing to do, though. And then we can delete that, or duplicate that over there. And the final thing we have to duplicate is the springs. And then we're finally done with all the springs at that point, actually. So technically these should be the same width and everything. So I am going to Edit Mesh, extract these springs here, just so both of the springs are their own object. And go to Modify, Center Pivot, and just Control duplicate those, bring those up, and just sort of get them into the correct angle that we are looking for here. So this part could be a bit finicky, but you just got to play around with it and wait until you get it. It seems like we got it here. Yep, and we are actually going to have to delete these, so it really doesn't matter if it's... Oh, wait, this seems to be a bit off. Okay, so this is on a bit of an angle. This one seems to be okay, though. That's odd. I'm going to go into my top view just by pressing spacebar. And I'm going to turn off this grid so it's easier to see everything. Let's see if I can just rotate this a bit and just make it a bit more in position and then push it back. And same with this one. Rotate it a bit so I can push it into position a bit more. I'm not quite sure why that happened. Either way, it's really not that big of a deal, because what we can do is, since we have to delete these anyways, we can just make these next ones slightly different positioning. So I'm just selecting both of those, duplicating them, and moving them into position here. And now they seem to be perfectly fine, so that's a bit weird. And just like that, our springs are complete. So I'm not going to merge anything yet, just because I know that we have more stuff up here, so I might as well just merge it all together at the same time. We do have to do this part though, which is also another part that's fairly easy to do. It also has this part here, so I'm not going to forget about that. So let's just sort of do this one part at a time. This part's super easy. We're just going to do a planer from the y-axis and cut it from the bottom. Polygon, cut UV edges, and sort of do a horizontal unfold. So that part's super easy. This part is just as easy, just with a couple more steps. So I'm going to select everything and then just deselect this main ring. So these two parts can be planered in the same way. Oh, and deselect this again, of course. And this can be UV'd in the z-axis, it appears to be. So with both of these selected, I can select them all and go to the unfold options. Once again, horizontal first and then vertical. And now our shells are unfolded here. They do have a bit of a different checker size, so I'm just going to resize this to be a bit more appropriate. Fit that in somewhere, and then we just have to do this outside part, which is super easy. Once again, just a planer from, let's say, the y-axis, and then just cut it here from the bottom. Unfold it like we have been doing with everything else here. And that's that part already done. Super, super easy. What we can do now with this is resize it to an appropriate size. I'm going to put it everywhere else, or with all the other sort of screw pieces and whatnot. And what we can actually do now is select these and go to Edit Mesh, Extract. And before we move it or duplicate it or anything, what I'm actually going to do is delete this part here. Same with this. And now we should be good to go and duplicate these parts here. Modify, center pivot, so it's easier to work with. And then just Control D to duplicate. And just for a little bit of extra detail, we can give it a little bit of a twist. And I just want to make sure it lines up with where the screw is on the other side, roughly at least. Alright, next we can delete these bolts up here. As we know, we already have replacement bolts prepared. And let's just grab that. Here's one. Control duplicate. And let's just zoom in. I'm hitting F to get exactly zoomed into the object I've selected, by the way. And then we can just bring that through. Once again, in the rotate Y, it's 180 degrees. Control duplicate. And Control duplicate once again. At this point, we can go ahead and rotate just to add some difference between them. This one I might even move a bit more. And then this final head part, and then we can sort of get to the final parts here and put it all together and sort it all out, and then we are done. We're getting close. So if you're still with me here, guys, hopefully you're learning some cool stuff. Hopefully this is really useful, because I know a lot of people really do struggle with UVing. It's definitely a bit more of a harder to wrap your head around, no pun intended of course, but it does take a while to get used to. So I'm going to select all of these. This is very similar to what we did before with the other connector piece. I'm just going to select all of these faces here and do a planer in the Z-axis. And let's see here. Let's just do a horizontal and vertical unfold That's also a way that you can flip it on its own. If anything needs to be flipped, usually when you do an unfold, it will automatically flip it. So let's get all these pieces arranged into sort of a shape where they're very snug together. So essentially just sort of getting pieces close and tight with one another. That should be good for now. Actually, I might as well just do this, right? Yeah. And then once again, selecting the outside ones, doing a planar from Y. Selecting the bottom edges because that's where it's least likely to be seen. And where am I going here? Polygon, cut UV edges, and then just another horizontal unfold. Super simple stuff here, making sure everything's the same size, which it totally is. And scaling that to the same size as everything else. Oh, I think I just hit Control Z there. Scaling everything to the same size. And just moving that out of the way somewhere. So at this point, what I want to do is, since we've taken care of everything but the main head, I'm going to merge everything and move them to their correct locations. So I'm just select everything here, go to Mesh, Combine, Modify, Center Pivot. And I'm just going to make sure all of the faces are sort of out of the way from one another and not overlapping or anything like that. So let's keep this going. Also, it shows if there are things that are overlapping when you have this selected, which is a super, super useful tool. I'm going to move these down because I can already tell that there's quite a few overlapping. These are most likely overlapping. Yep. Same with over here, since we duplicated these UV coordinates. Flip it over. Overlapping. Overlapping. And like I said earlier, it's totally fine to have things overlapping. In most cases, especially if things are going to be like super mirrored and stuff, it really doesn't matter all that much. But if you can avoid it, I would recommend having things not overlapping. Just because it adds more detail, right? Everything will be a unique part. It's not necessarily needed, but say you want every screw to be different. Like if someone's going to be looking up that close, the only way to possibly do that is if you have all of your UV coordinates different, right? So it is cool to be able to do that. And I think that should be it now. Like if I select shell and shell, yep. So we have everything separated. The only part left to do now is the head and the cable. So let's start with this little shaft part here. Super, super easy stuff. You guys already know how to do this. UV planar from the y-axis. And I'm just gonna get into a better angle here. It's really small. I wonder why I made it like that. And then we can go to polygon, cut UV edge. I'm just going to blow that up quite a bit. And then what we can do is do a vertical unfold, because we want it to unfold up and down, and then a horizontal unfold. And I think actually it seems to be a bit off. I want all of these to be perfectly aligned, so I'm going to select these edges and press this arrow that pushes them all to the right, and this I'm going to push all to the left. Then I'm just going to manually make these larger so they're a bit more even. And then maybe if I try and do a vertical unfold now, yep, now it's a perfect shell. So I was just sort of getting these closer to be perfectly aligned with one another horizontally before I did my vertical unfold. Because this is just a perfect cylinder, it's just an awkward angle to just sort of be doing this projection from. Scale that appropriately and move that off to the side. Oh, I think I also have these overlapping as well. Let me just see something real quick. Yep, okay. I actually have this. What is going on here? Yeah, so this was overlapping. But for some reason this part didn't come with it. Where is it on here? Oh, it's still here. Okay. So I forgot to move this secondary. Wait a second, then where's this one? Okay, so there was just geometry hidden away in there, sorry. When I moved over this secondary rotation point, I had this sort of connector part in the mesh, and I was just wondering where it was. So, just a super simple thing. If you are ever wondering where a piece is, you can just select the faces here on the UV editor and press F in here, and it'll take your camera directly to where it is. F stands for frame, so when you hit F, it'll frame whatever you have selected. I'm now going to select this connector point and go to UV, planar, and Y. And just sort of do a standard unfold by cutting. Let's cut something like in here where it's really hard to see. And do a horizontal unfold. And just resize that so the squares are the same as everything else. And just move that off to the side. Next we have the lamp head itself. Now before doing something like this, what I would highly recommend doing is sort of repositioning it slightly. Like for me, I think for this it would be easiest if I rotated it to be facing down a little bit. Like so, just because when I do, oh, and with this as well. If that goes with it, yep. So now if I like do projections from the y-axis, they're going to be more accurate than they were before. And then I can just rotate them back to normal just by going to the attribute editor of, well, I guess I can just manually rotate it back. It's not that big of a deal. So I'm just going to start doing some projections now. And this part is essentially very similar to this bottom part. So if you're able to do that with ease, you should be able to do this part very easily as well. I'm going to select rings of faces that I think should unfold very well together. Maybe up to about there. And the reason I'm stopping there is because this is where an obvious seam could be, because people aren't going to be looking there, and this is an obvious seam because this is actually a texture change. This part should be plastic while this is metal. So it's okay to have a seam like that. And then from here, I'm going to do a planar projection from X. I want it to be head on so that I can hide my seams back here. So edge, 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 edge. Bit harder to see actually. I'm just gonna make this on its own so it's easier to sort of see. But once again, just selecting the edges up the part we UV'd. And then once again, polygon, cut UV edges. I'm gonna rotate this slightly before I unfold it to make it a bit more accurate. And then a horizontal unfold first, and then a vertical unfold. And that's looking pretty good all the way around. There's a bit of distortion, like a bit of wobbliness, but overall, very happy with that result. Let's get to the inside part now. Okay, so I don't want to get this part, but this part seems to be what I want to be UVing. This can just be done from a planar axis Y. And then I can just do a horizontal and a vertical. And as you can see, it is pretty distorted in here, but when I put the lamp in there, it really doesn't matter. As long as it's good around the edges, that's all that really matters for this specific object. So it's a bit cheeky, I understand that. It could definitely be done better, but for this object, that's pretty spot on. There's just a bit of distortion there, but at least for me, I know that this is going to be a light, so when you look at it, you won't even be able to see this part anyways, because this is emitting actual light. So that's good. That part is done as well. Now we can move on to the next part here. I wonder how far up I can do this before it's a good idea to cut off. About there, and then we can do a planer from X once again. Get that same seam line as before. If it helps to turn off the texture when cutting, I'd highly recommend doing that. Sometimes I just turn off the texture to make sure my edge that I'm making is actually looking good, and then turn it back on when I'm done. So I can then go to polygon cut UV edges and make sure everything's good when I do a nice unfold. This one might be a little bit more tight. I can tell there's already going to be possibly some issues with it, with the bottom texture being a bit more intense. I'm going to select some of these bottom faces and then just sort of do a none unfold to see how that affects it. And I don't really like that. I mean, you could do this in multiple parts, but I don't think it's that big of a deal to sort of do it in this manner. I think that, for the sake of this, is a pretty good unfold. Now we can move to the top part. This is similar to the screw in a sense, where I can just sort of do a UV planer from Y. And then just select these, horizontal and vertical. Scale that so it's similar to everything else, and maybe I'll just put it in there. And we are almost done. We are just going to get this piece here in the X like everything else. Select this edge, polygon, cut UV edges. I'm going to select all of those UVs and do a horizontal unfold and a vertical one. Scale it to an appropriate size. And just that top piece. And then after that, it's just the coil. UV planar Y. Horizontal and vertical. Scale it down. Sweet. So now what we can do, oh, and this part, of course. This part's super easy though. This is a straight up planar in the y-axis. As you can see, since it's already like a spherical shape, it's super easy. Yeah, we're just going to unfold it anyways to smoothen out some of the hiccups, and it's super good, covering up most of those problemed areas. And just going to scale it. This actually, the texture doesn't have to be too important on this, simply because it's just light, right? There's no actual texture detail or anything on it. So I'm going to scale that so it's mostly the same. There are a bit more detailed areas up there, but that's okay. And then I'm going to select the two parts we rotated and just sort of rotate them back into place. And hopefully it doesn't give us too much trouble here. Okay. That seems to be perfect. So now we have all of that done. I'm just going to sort of move these out of the way. And now we just got to do this big coil. So this part is very similar to the springs, except for we're going to cut it in multiple places, but strategically. So the thing is, just make sure you don't have any end pieces when you're doing stuff like this, and if you do have end pieces that are sealing up your coil, or your string, or your rope, or whatever it is, just to UV those first. So since I don't have any, it shouldn't be a problem. For this though, like before, I'm going to select all of them and go to polygon. I don't know what I just pressed there. Okay, hopefully that was what it was before. I don't know what that is actually. Weird. I feel like my cursor changed. I really don't know. Maybe it did. Alright, let's just pretend nothing happened. I'll have to look into that after I record this video. But select those faces of the coil and go to polygon and unitize. And now we have all these faces on top of each other. This would probably be a good time to save as well, because it might slow down your computer quite a bit. I'm going to save my scene to the desktop just as tut for tutorial. And what you could also do actually to sort of speed things up, and as you can see, we have all of these like little details there, all this history. So we could also go to edit and delete all by type and history to speed everything up. So that's going to make it a lot faster as well. So with all of these selected, I'm going to go into edge mode and double click all of the edges on our coil. So I'm just going to find an edge, double click it, or rather just select all of these edges here on these squares. And now we got to find where we want our seam to be. Now this one's a bit more obvious than before. We just want the seam to be at the bottom part. So I'm going to hold Control and double click that bottom part where we don't want the seam to be. And most of it is hidden. It's just these parts where it's poking out where it's not. But that's totally fine. And then we can go to Polygon, cut UV edges, Polygon, move and sew UV edges. And this is going to be just a massive chunk, and it's going to get bigger when we unfold it, so just be prepared to sort of deal with a very large shell here. So I can go to a horizontal unfold, it may take a second, and then a vertical unfold, and now we got this ginormous shell that represents the cable. So obviously it's way too big. We gotta position that and move it back to where it needs to be and sort of put it into a reasonable size. And I'm going to scale it until it makes sense here in the viewport, until it's these same size squares, which it roughly is now. But we can also cut it in places where it sort of makes sense, so it's easier to work with. For example, if I were to cut it somewhere here where it's relatively hidden, I wouldn't mind that. Also, it's pretty close to, well, not necessarily that close to the middle. The middle is more or less somewhere around here, is it not? Yeah, and this is a pretty good spot to cut as well because it's not a very high interest point. Not a lot of people are looking there on the cable, so if I do a polygon cut UV edge, we'll have 2 shells for it now. And they're a bit more appropriate in size. And now everything's UV'd. You can cut this into more pieces if you want. Like, for example, this part draping off the edge could probably be cut because no one's looking back there and part of it is off the table. But for now, I think that's it. The only thing we have to worry about now is fitting all of this into one square. So for me at least, when I am sort of putting my UVs together, my favorite thing to do is sort of make a rough shape to begin with. Just try and get everything really tight. But I like to, yeah, just make everything like roughly a square before I try and fit it into the square, if that makes any sense at all. So I'm just going to sort of move these as tight as possible up to one another, because you want to maximize your UV space, right? You want to make it so that there's the smallest amount of gaps in between everything. That way you can blow them up bigger and have more texture space when you are doing your texturing in, say, Substance or Quixel or 3D Coat or anything like that. One important thing though is to make sure we don't really change the size of any of these things, simply because we want everything to share the exact same amount of texture space. If one area is a lot bigger than another area in relation to each other, that essentially means we're giving more texture quality to a certain area, which is important for some things, but for this lamp there's really nothing that we need that requires more texture space than everything else. So let me just move this stuff out of the way as I try and find an efficient way to sort of fit this all in here. I could probably put the screws down there. This can go there. And it's just sort of like a big puzzle. I'm not going to lie, I actually kind of enjoy this part because it's just more or less, yeah, just a big puzzle. And it's more or less just trying to get everything to fit in. Just make sure nothing's overlapping. That's going to be a big issue if textures are overlapping. Because then whatever you color on that one spot will apply to multiple polygons rather than just the single polygon you intended it to be applied to. So this part, I can't really give too many pointers except for, yeah, don't have things overlapping, keep things as tight as possible, and don't go outside of the boundary box, more or less. If you can do all of those, essentially your UVs will be done very, very well. So now I'm going to try and fit all of these in here as best as I can. I hope I can, because this would be a perfect little spot to have everything. And I should be able to by the looks of it. So just moving them over piece by piece. And just keeping it all tight. Just don't want anything overlapping, of course. And let's see. These parts are actually pretty good on their own, just like that. Stick that up straight. We have all these pieces here. Maybe like so. And I think at this point what I can confidently do is try and fit it into a square, and then I can fit the rest in accordingly. So I'm going to select everything and just, yeah, make sure everything is selected and just sort of position it to fit in like so. And from here I can try and get everything in as tight as possible. So I can try and get these pieces in here. And maybe I can try rotating these. What I'm just starting to realize now is I didn't actually give all of the springs UVs, like individual UV shells. But I'm not too worried about that right now, because it seems like everything's going to fit relatively well. Except for this. This is giving me some trouble. Let's try and do this. I'm also trying to make sure I keep things that should be grouped together. Like... things that are close together in the model should be close together in the UV sheet as well, just to keep things simple when you are texturing. And more or less, like I could go in and tighten this all up, but I think for the most part, that's essentially it right there. Like that, for the most part, is how I would do all of my UVs. Like I said, there's probably more room in there where I could sort of even things out a bit more. But I think for the sake of this tutorial, that is a good explanation as to how I UV it. Like I said, the springs, I could go ahead and give those their own spot as well. So I'm just going to double click the springs. And yeah, there's definitely overlap there. So I might as well just do that and show you guys how I do that. Double click, and then I could even just like put this, yeah, it's not overlapping at all. They are flipped though. So let me just sort of move that over. Move that over. So now there is room for these. And they do need to be flipped because they are red. So once again, it's a good old flip. And now we're in business. That is the entire thing done there. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please leave a like on this video. I would greatly appreciate that. Also, leave comments as to what other tutorials you'd like to see. I had a lot of people asking for a tutorial like this for quite some time, so I thought it was about time to go ahead and give you guys a full-on hour-and-a-half, really in-depth UV tutorial. I think next what I want to do is Marvelous Designer, but I'm always open to suggestions. Also, Substance Painter. I want to do some more advanced tutorials on that as well. But let me guys know, hopefully you enjoyed this and found it useful. Like I said, comment, like, subscribe, anything like that to support the channel would be greatly appreciated. But thank you guys so much for watching. Once again, my name has been Tie-Dye. Hopefully you learned something and hopefully enjoy the video, and I will catch you in the next one. See ya.